Flagship, Steven? Are you sure about that? Jared Polin, FronosPhoto.com, and this is a real-world preview of the Canon R1, the flagship, at least according to Canon. And you'll see why I say that when we get through all of these specs. Canon flew me, along with a bunch of other creators, out to Phoenix, Arizona to not just test out the R1, but also test out the R5 Mark II, which we also have a preview for. You can check that link out down below. Now, we went to Phoenix, Arizona in June, where it was 110 degrees. So we had to shoot indoors. We shot something called futsal, which is basically mini soccer on like a basketball type of court. We shot basketball, where there was an awesome team from Japan that's a travel team. They were really good. And then I snuck off and went and photographed some golf because we were staying at the Biltmore Hotel and there was a Biltmore Golf Club. And I thought that would be the perfect place to get a golfer doing a full-on swing to see how the readout speed is in this flagship R1. Now, in terms of how much time we had with the camera, not much. We had 2 big shoots to do, and we maybe had 3 hours of actual full hands-on time using it, so there wasn't a lot of time. And also, as a housekeeping note, Steven was not with me to do B-roll because he was on vacation. So any of the B-roll you get, I had Manny Ortiz guy, he helped me out, but I also did some 360 footage, and of course, I recorded my electronic viewfinder. And the main reason this isn't a full-on review, other than we didn't have a lot of time with it, is that it is truly a pre-production camera. So much of a pre-production camera that my play button was backwards. I knew something was off. It looked weird. Not a big deal. Everything else seemed to work fine. So now let's take a look at the body. It is not the same body as the R3. It is very similar in terms of button layout with some tweaks, but it is bigger. It's wider. The first time I held on to it, I was like, this feels like a double wide trailer. The R3 was one of the best feeling cameras in your hands, at least until Sony came out with the A9 III, and that superseded that because that's the best feeling camera on the market now. But the R3 was fantastic because it's a pro body that's compact and light. It weighed in at 1.81 pounds or 822 grams, whereas the R1 weighs in now at 2.03 pounds or 920 grams. So it is bigger, it is heavier. But again, it's a flagship camera according to Canon, which means you expect a beefier body. Personally, I think they could have stuck with an R3 body and it would have been perfectly fine because that is an unbelievably great feeling body. Now, they did make some tweaks from the R3 to the R1, and one of those is the locking door for the card. So there's a new door. There's a new on and off switch. I got used to the old on and off switch. You would just press down, it would turn the camera on and off. Now it goes the other way. It's more vertical, and you just have to switch it. One of the reasons I'm going through some of these minor changes is if you have an R3 and you're trying to decide if the R1 is for you, these are things that you might want to know. And if you just want to know what the R1 has, that's why I'm going over all of this stuff to tell you exactly what it has. Now, for the vertical grip, they added an on and off switch, which wasn't there on the R3, which was kind of questionable that they left it out because it has always been on their flagships. Oh, that's interesting. They didn't consider the R3 their flagship, though we still hold out that the R3 was supposed to be the R1 originally, and then they came out with the A1 and they're like, well, we better go back to the drawing board. Canon will never admit that. They'll tell us that that's not the case. We just have a feeling that that might be the case, and that's just us guessing. There's no validity or nothing to support that other than us with wishful thinking. They did add a third multifunction button to the top back left of the camera. And for those of you that remember the R3 and the hot shoe cap that it comes with that would always just slide off and fall off, well, they came out with a new cap that is a weather sealed and locking cap for the hot shoe. And when I say locking, I mean they used like Loctite because it was very hard. It took me like 4 minutes to get this thing off, trying to push the button and slide it off. So if you never use the hot shoe, you want to keep this on there because it's going to keep it safe from getting wet, locks on there, and doesn't pop off. Now, one of the biggest improvements over the R3 is the electronic viewfinder. We are now looking at a massive 9.4 million dot EVF that has anti-fogging on it, as well as can do 120 frames per second refresh rate, which gives you that blackout-free look that I've never really noticed that you don't have a blackout-free anymore, because they all have it at this point. But this is a massive, I mean, you have a bigger camera now, slightly bigger than the R3, and they used all of that extra real estate to squeeze in a huge, amazingly sharp and bright and clear and better electronic viewfinder. It's one of the best I've ever used. It's huge. I'm not used to hearing that. And one of the reasons that the EVFs have been larger on the R3 and now the R1 and also the R5 Mark II is that you have the Eye Control 2. We didn't know if they were going to continue with Eye Control after the first experiment of the R3, but clearly they are all in on it. And I will tell you, when I set it up, I can't show you it working because my eye has to be looking through the camera, but I have a nystagmus. My eyes shake back and forth. That's right, like a Polaroid picture. They shake, and that might make it difficult for some system to track my eyes. It didn't have a problem tracking my eyes at all. I registered my eye, I looked at the subject that I wanted to focus on, and it worked really well. So if you are shooting with multiple subjects in a frame and you just want to focus on one person over the other based off of where you're looking, it did work much better than the first version. Now, one of the coolest buttons that was on a 1DX Mark III as well as the R3 was the new Smart Controller. That was where you could press it for AF on, or also drag your finger across it to move your focusing points. Now, you can still move your finger across it, but it's now 2 stages. There's 2 steps to the press, like a shutter button where you could half press it and it can do one thing, and you can full press it and have it do something else. It's a customizable button that I didn't have time to customize because I couldn't figure out what would I actually do a half press for and then a full press, but you can do quite a lot of things with it, as you can see, and that is for you to figure out what features you want to set there. In terms of battery life, you have the same exact battery as the R3, which has been the same exact battery as the 1DX Mark II and the 1DX Mark III. They haven't upgraded it. I shot over 6,000 photos in a very short amount of time, and the battery was perfectly fine. It's what you would expect with a larger battery. This camera has the same 3.2-inch, 2.1 million dot vari-angled touchscreen as the R5 Mark II, but the R3 had a 4.1 million dot touchscreen. Why did they go the other way? This is a flagship, for God's sakes. I still don't like that it doesn't get flush to the back. I personally prefer something like the A9 III or even the Z9, dare I say, but the A9 III took what the Z9 did and made it even better. I want to be able to flip the screen out like this and hold it down to the ground and be able to see my lines and keep them straight. Flip out to the side and rotate, not my favorite option, but of course not a deal breaker. Let me cut in here real quick and let you know that this video is brought to you by B&H and their Payboo credit card, where you pay the tax and B&H pays you back instantly for the same amount, which is kind of insane, but it actually does work. Now, I'm very selective when it comes to applying for new credit cards, but since I was making a $14,000 purchase at B&H, it was kind of a no-brainer to sign up and save a bunch of tax. Now, if you're wondering, I bought 36 new hard drives for a server that we're building here at the studio. Now, in fact, I applied right on B&H's website, and in minutes, I was checking out with my Payboo card. Now, there's 2 ways that you can save. 1, you pay the tax and B&H pays you back instantly, or 2, you get 12 months special financing on purchases of $599 or more. Now, like I said earlier, I personally chose to save the tax because in my recent purchase, I saved $818.64, and I'm saving tax on everything else that I order, from 4x5 film and chemicals for my baseball project to cameras, lenses, accessories, computers, TVs, and even doorbells. Whether you spend $10 or $10,000, those tax savings do add up. Now remember to always charge responsibly.
Low on cash, but still need to get your boo? Don't worry.
For more information and to apply for your Payboo card right now, head on over to the link that's on the screen or down below in the description. Now, one of the things in the past that people didn't like about the R3 is that it did not have a full HDMI port. You now have a full HDMI port and not just a micro one. So for those video shooters out there, that is a welcomed addition. backlit buttons. All of the buttons, or a lot of the buttons, now light up on the back of the camera. That comes in handy more than you would think. When you're in the pit shooting a concert, you can't see certain buttons. And yeah, you do know where most things are, but in the dark, you can't figure it out all the time. Now these buttons light up. This isn't revolutionary to just Canon, but the buttons light up, and it's actually really a refreshing thing, especially after you've used an R3 for as long as I have. Now let's move on to the menu. They slightly reorganized the way that the menu looks. They made some of the bars thicker. They added some names and words there that weren't there before, so you know which sections you're in. And they added a new color and a new section. I don't know how they decided on olive green when they already had a green, but for anybody that has set up the custom settings for any Canon camera, you know that the custom button settings are all in the orange menu. Now they're in some olive green menu. Now let's move on to the important stuff. I mean, yeah, the outside's important, but it's what's on the inside that counts. That's what the girls tell me all the time. Now, when I first put my eye up to the camera, I noticed a new percentage meter in the top left where my frames are, where I know how many shots I have left. Now it's an indicator that's like 96% of your card left, which I think is kind of weird. You can turn that off and just go back to the way of just showing how many shots you have left. Let's take a look inside of the camera. We have a brand new 24 megapixel backside illuminated stacked sensor. It's not the same sensor as the R3. It has faster readout speed than the R3. That's what they tell us. They say it's as fast as a 1DX Mark III's shutter, which we've seen with the Z9 and the A1. They've had faster readout speeds than the R3. But the R3 didn't really have issues with bowing, and this sensor doesn't seem to have issues either, and I saw that when I was photographing the golfer. When the golfer goes through his swing, I told him to go all out with the swing, and there's a point where you're like, is that bowing or is that club flex? So if you don't know the difference between club flex and bowing, then is it a problem? Because you can see at the exact bottom of the swing, everything is straight. So it seems to be as fast as advertised, and that is a good thing to test out, and I'm glad I was able to shoot some golf. Now with that being said, flagship? Flagship? What do people think about when you say flagship? They think about high megapixels. They think about the most loaded, fully featured camera that you could ever think of, the top of the top of the top, the best of the best of the best with honor, sir. You hear 24 megapixels and you instantly go, that doesn't sound like a flagship. It sounds more like an R3 Mark II, question mark? That's what it sounds like to me when you have the 24 megapixels. Yes, you have the bigger body. Yes, you have a lot of tweaks. And when we get to autofocus, you'll see a major difference in the autofocus capability. But does all of that add up to the word flagship? I'm gonna just tell you no, it doesn't add up to the word flagship. It adds up to the word R3 Mark II. I call this an R3 Mark II. I would have been perfectly happy with them calling it R3 Mark II, and I know everybody's gonna sit here and say, flagship? You call this your flagship? And it doesn't surpass other things that are out there. Nikon's got 45 megapixels in their flagship. Sure, it doesn't autofocus as good as this thing does. Sony has their A1 at 50. They have an A9 III, which runs circles around this in terms of shooting speed, which we haven't even gotten to yet. So think about it from there. I don't consider this a flagship. Flagship features in some parts, yes. Flagship all around, the answer is no. R3 Mark II, yeah. Now in terms of ISO, natively you go from 100 up to 102,400. Now, I could shoot RAW files, but I can't open the RAW files as of yet. So it's very difficult to sit here and say, well, these files are great, these files aren't good, but I did shoot as high as 51,200, and they look very good as JPEGs, and I had high ISO noise reduction off because I want to see what the file would look like. That's where 24 megapixels shines over 50 and shines over the global shutter of the A9 III and a 45 megapixel sensor of the Z9. 24 is perfectly fine. We saw that with the R3. And this is not trying to defend Canon or be an apologist for Canon. This is me saying that back in the day when I used a D2XS, and got a 12 megapixel file from a crop sensor camera and am able to blow up those files today to 4 feet by 6 feet at my house to hang on my wall with metal prints, and you will never see an issue with that, 24 is perfectly fine. I rather have 24 megapixels and cleaner high ISO than 50 megapixels and not as clean ISO. With that being said, the high ISO capability and the cleanliness of the ISOs in this camera are going to be better than the R3. Is it going to be drastic? We'll have to wait and see. We've already seen a little bit between the R3 and the A9 III, almost being imperceivably different until you really get up close and personal to those files, and you can see that there's a slight minor difference. But we'll have to wait and see when we get the raw files. These files so far look very good. Now let's get on to the autofocus. The rumor sites called for quad pixel AF. Well, they were wrong. You have dual pixel AF, but with cross-type autofocusing sensors, which are built on to this new sensor. So the R3 doesn't have cross-type. The R5 Mark II doesn't have the cross-type. But you have dual pixel AF with these cross-type sensors, which means you can now focus better on horizontal lines. The autofocus in this camera is exquisite. Now, one of the reasons that the autofocus is so good in this camera is that Canon has added a brand new Digic accelerator processor. Now, before with the R3, you had just the Digic X processor. You now have the Digic X processor as well as this Digic accelerator, which has deep learning subject tracking. So that's very similar to what you would hear from Sony with their A9 III. They added a separate AI processor for tracking subjects. But I can tell you that this one works even better than the Sony. It has the best autofocusing system I've ever seen in any camera, period. More on that and sample footage coming up, because there is a new feature that Canon added that is like, when you see it in action, and the first time I saw it, I had to call these people over and say, how did you do this? This is incredible. Now let's talk about frames per second. You can get 40 frames per second in 14-bit RAW. Now it does still have a mechanical shutter at 12 frames per second, but Flagship, 40 frames per second? Didn't the R8 and the R6 Mark II give you 40 frames per second? Now, mind you, they are slower readout speeds, but they did 40 frames per second. Now, with that 40 frames per second, you can dial it down. You can do weird odd increments all the way down to 3 shots and all the way up to 40 shots. Now, in terms of going faster, let's see, 120 frames per second doesn't exist in this camera because it doesn't go above 40 frames per second. That's the max. Now, 40 frames per second is a lot. But when you look at this under a microscope against something like an A9 III that does 120 frames per second in a very similar price point in 24 megapixels, you sit there and you question Flagship. Flagship? R3 Mark II, perfectly fine. And let's throw some love to Nikon. The Z6 III that just came out can do 120 frames per second. Mind you, it's in JPEG normal, but it can do it. Now, what about that 195 frames per second mode that the R3 had? Did that carry over? No, that didn't carry over, at least not now, maybe in a firmware update, but it could do it. Why can we not do that here? This is a flagship camera. You guys have had almost 4+ years to work on this camera to give it the things that we expected a flagship camera to have. It's all right if you called it an R3 Mark II. I mean, it's fine that you call it a flagship. I don't really care. I'm really happy with the results. But when you put it under a microscope against everything else, you just have to call a spade and point this stuff out. Now, one of the features that I've wanted for a while is pre-shooting. And yes, this Canon R3 Mark II, this Canon R1 adds pre-shooting for a half a second. Now, that's fine. The A9 III from Sony does a full second, and Nikon doesn't do any seconds when it comes to shooting RAW because you could only get pre-shooting when you shoot JPEG. The problem here is that you're locked to a half a second every time. So that means if I want to take one picture, I'm getting 21 pictures because you can buffer 20 shots pre-shooting. I love pre-shooting, but sometimes I want to dial it down to say 5, 6, 7, maybe 8. So maybe I want less than 1/10 of a second. The A9 III lets me do that. Another issue with the pre-shooting from this R1 is that when you press the button and you take the pictures, it doesn't tell you which picture was the one that you took. And the reason I bring that up is because Sony did that with the A9 III. They got it right out of the box, giving you the ability to dial in from 0.01 of a second all the way up to 1 full second, and it puts a star on the first picture that you took, and anything before that you know was the pre-shooting. Flagship cameras would get that right out of the box. Now remember, this is shooting raw pre-shooting. That's why I mentioned that the Z9 can't do it, because it doesn't shoot raw. You can do the raw for a half a second. These are things that I expected Canon to get right, and yes, they might fix it in a firmware, but right out of the gate, the Flagship should already have this, especially when the A9 III already exists on the market and all you needed to do was be like, that's a cool feature. Let's borrow that. Now, I'm sure you're wondering how long you can shoot with pre-shooting and 40 frames per second. Well, we held the button down and we got right around 10 seconds of raw shooting. Now, part of that is because you have the dual CF Express B card slots in this camera. And the funny thing is that this camera might not even need it because you're doing 24 megapixel files, whereas the R5 Mark II splits the cards with an SD and a CF Express B slot. That camera could use it because it's higher megapixels and fast frame rates. It could have used that extra card slot, not just the SD. But smashing the button for 10 seconds, you're getting quite a lot of photos, whereas the R3 was roughly 5 seconds before you outran the buffer and had to wait. Let me jump in here real quick because I want to show you FroPak 4 in action on this photo right here, taken with a Canon, starting with Blue's Clues, followed by Brooklyn, C41, Copper Tone, High C, Kaleidoscope, Mel Brooks, Saltwater Taffy, Thick, Tintype, and Wet Hot American Summer. But check this out, my all-time favorite from FroPak 1 is Skittles. With one click of a button, we go boom. But check this out, exclusive and all new to FroPak 4, we've got 4 custom adaptive Lightroom presets that include Face Enhance, Full Body Enhance, Eye Only Enhance, as well as Background Blur. So look, if you want to speed up your raw workflow, give yourself a great starting point, or you're just tired of other people's presets sucking, ours don't suck. We've created 14 all-new custom Lightroom presets that you can check out right now at froknowsphoto.com/FroPak4. While you're over there, you can play with the sliders to see the befores and the afters, and if you decide to pick them up right now, they are currently on sale. Or if you want to get the Grand Slam bundle that includes FroPak 1, 2, 3, and 4, and of course Skittles, you will save even more. Now, let's get back to the video. Now, for anybody who was yelling that 24 megapixels maybe wasn't enough and you want a little bit more, what about pixel shift? Well, you don't have pixel shift in this camera. That's where the camera would take like 4 different pictures and then mush them together and give you higher resolution. But they did build in some AI upscaling inside of this camera. So it's JPEG only. You can't upscale from the RAW file. If you shoot RAW, you convert the RAW file in the camera, then you tell the camera, you select the which image that you want, and it's gonna up-res it to a 96 megapixel image. I'm not sure where this would be used, but if you're someone who wants to crop in quite far, you could go ahead and crop the image and then you could up-res it, or you could up-res it first and then crop it. That doesn't make up for the fact that it's 24 megapixels. I don't know that it's going to be used too often, but it is a feature that they added. Now, let's get into one of the most mind-blowing features that I've ever seen, called Action Priority. This is a function that you turn on inside of the camera, and there's 3 different sports right now that you could use it with: soccer, basketball, and volleyball. Basically sports that involve big balls. Now, here's the gist of it. It is a predictive autofocus that takes into account the player's joints and movements and where the ball's going, and it anticipates where the autofocus thinks it should go. And it's mind-blowing. The way that this worked for basketball was insane. The fact is that the player could come towards me, the IAF is tracking the eye. By the way, I tested it with an 85-1.2 shooting at 1.2, because if it can pass that test, it can pass everything. But the player would run towards me, juke and jive, dribble, and then kick it out to the guy waiting to shoot a 3-pointer. And before you even got there, the autofocus was on the eye and skipping any distraction that might be there. Now, let me show you an example when I used the old way that I would autofocus, with like the all-encompassing but with an active autofocusing point. Now, what you see happening is that it missed and it hit something in the background, it got distracted, and then it jumped over and found the subject. That doesn't happen with this action priority. It was incredible in this situation, but even better was in a scrimmage game situation where we're trying to find who has the ball and the camera is doing better than me. So before I even know where the ball's going, the autofocus is on the player where it needs to be. And if it sees a distraction, it doesn't lose the subject that still has the ball. It still stays there. It reads the back of the heads. If a distraction gets in the way and then the player reappears, it knows that. It's insane how this works. And right now it's only 3 sports, but I think that they're gonna come out in the future with more and more sports. This is a feature that when it was explained to us, they explained it as maybe it's a basic feature and they didn't wanna push it too hard. This is a feature they really need to hammer home. It's not about you're not a good photographer if you need this mode. This mode makes a great photographer even better. It's insane how well this worked. So enough about me telling you. I know we just showed you a few quick clips, but here is a montage of the R1's autofocus in action. Another new feature that's pretty cool if it can fully work and get better into the future is called People Priority AF. Now, the way that this works is you could line up a bunch of players or people before a game or a match, and you can take a picture, and then you go ahead and select a person, and you prioritize them for the autofocus. Now, they give you 10 different squares for prioritizing, 1 through 10. It's kind of like your top 8 from MySpace. Plus 2, because there's 10 for anybody that remembers MySpace. So I registered 1 soccer player, and so when his face showed up, and you have to see the face, it gave a little icon that showed the priority icon. So when you would press the shutter halfway down, it's gonna prioritize that subject over everybody else. Where this might come in handy is if you're photographing, say, a musician in a crowd of people, and you registered their face into the camera, into spot 1, it's not gonna see the distractions of other people. It's always gonna prioritize that face. So that is a good feature if it works all the time. Will it work with helmets? If you're shooting football and you only wanna focus on, say, the quarterback, I doubt it's gonna work in that situation right now. But the way that it works, you could put 1 through 10. It's gonna prioritize 1 over 2, 2 over 3, so on and so forth. If it doesn't see 1, it goes to number 2. So that's just a new feature that's there. It has promise. It does work, but is it something that is going to be a really good feature into the future? Now, for those that are familiar with Canon's autofocus cases, you do have the cases here. Those were where you could prioritize, say, a tennis player or a skateboarder or just an erratic moving subject. You could choose those and then you could tweak them a little bit. They kind of knocked it down to just 2 different cases. Now, you do have the ability to create your own, but with how good this autofocus is, there's really not much of a need to go in there and tweak it as much as you might have had to do in the past. So in terms of Flagship, autofocus, 100% Flagship. Yes, That's incredible. Now let's move on to video. Now, one of the things they've done here, they essentially combined the cinema video menu with the EOS stills menu. So it's much more similar to using one of the C400s or C70s or R5Cs. It's more integrated and more familiar to people who use those cameras. So this would act very well as a B camera. Now, in terms of frame rates, basically you have the same frame rates as the R3. Flagship or R3 Mark II? Flagship or R3 Mark II, yeah. Okay, you can do 6K RAW up to 60p. You have DCI 4K up to 60p, which is oversampled from 6K. It now offers 2K as well as 1080, and those are oversampled options from 4K up to 60p. You've got 1080 up to 240 frames per second, and kind of something that we've wanted for a long time is audio with 120p, and it's full 120, not burnt in 30p. So you do have the option to also turn that off, the audio, but I don't know why you would now that you officially have that option. Now, they went ahead and tweaked the frame rate and resolution menu, which was kind of confusing, especially trying to use it in the real world when it was new, because if you tried to enable something, it said, well, you need to disable this in order to do that, and if you wanted to disable this, you had to enable it. It was all over the place and kind of confusing, so I wasn't a fan of that new change. Now, what I am a fan of are tally lights. I like tally lights on cameras, so the R5 Mark II has tally lights, and the R1 now has tally lights as well. They now offer C-Log 2, which has up to 16 stops of dynamic range. You now have 10-bit 422 video recording in not just log mode. So before you had to be in log in order to do that, and now you don't. You have 24-bit 4-channel audio through the digital hot shoe, and for some reason, there's no waveforms added like the R5 Mark II has waveforms. So not sure why they decided to leave that out here, but add it there, especially when this is the flagship. Now, speaking of flagship, does it get a flagship price? Flagship prices are usually astronomical. Well, this comes in right in that $6,000-ish mark, which is very similar to what you would see from other flagships out there. It's more expensive than what the Z9 is. It's less expensive than what the A1 came out at, but this is a flagship, and it's priced very similarly to the R3, which continually leads me back to the R3 Mark II moniker. Does it have flagship features? The answer to that is absolutely. But we know people are gonna harp on the fact that it's only 24 megapixels. And I've already proven that it doesn't matter how many megapixels you have. If you wanna be a cropper and you want more megapixels, they give you the option with the R5 Mark II. And I think there's a lot of people that have R3s who are waiting to see what the R1 is to determine should they upgrade from the R3, because it's going to be this major revolution to the R1, and they're scratching their head going, I don't know that I need to upgrade my R3 for some of those features. Yeah, pre-shooting's nice, 40 frames a second's nice, 30 frames a second's still really amazing. And that's where that whole flagship debate comes in. Let me jump in here real quick and say, would you like me to send you a free guide to capturing motion in low light situations? If you said yes, look for this orange box over on froknosphoto.com, put your name, email address in it, hit send it. I'm gonna send you that guide for free. The problem here is if you have an R3 right now, it's gonna be very difficult to sell it. You spent $6,000 for that R3 new. Well, you can get it refurbished, and I've seen it on Canon's own refurbished website store for $34.99. You can get it new in stores for $4,000. So that means if you try to sell it independently, you're gonna have to sell it for $3,000 or less. If you try to trade it into a store, it's gonna be $2,200 to $2,500 because the store has to turn around and sell it. That is a tough pill to swallow. And for those people that want more megapixels, even sports shooters, people with R3s, they might turn around and buy R5 Mark IIs to get 45 megapixels at 30 frames per second at a readout speed that is very similar to that of the R3. And so for those people that love to crop, you have that option. I don't know that they're gonna sell a lot of R1s. It is a hard sell for people that have R3s. It's a hard sell to get them to do that. Now look, you wanna call something a flagship? If Canon came out with an R1 with a 45 megapixel stacked sensor that shot super fast with readout speeds very similar to that of the R3, if not slightly better, then you might have been like, okay, I could see that as a flagship. I really could. Just something different. And that's the R5 Mark II, a camera that comes in at right around $4,000. That is going to be a huge, huge seller. Don't get me wrong, this R1 is a fantastically put together camera with the best autofocus I've seen in the history of cameras. So a big round of applause goes to the Canon engineers for being able to do stuff like that. Why it's not more, I don't have the answer to that. I would have called it an R3 Mark II and be perfectly happy with this upgrade. I'm gonna end up using an R1 because I can, and that's fine, but that's it. What would you guys use? Let me know down below. Thank you very much for watching. If you haven't checked out the R5 Mark II video yet, you can go check that out. It is linked down below. Thank you very much. Jared, PolinPhoto's Photo.com. See ya.